What's up guys, you're watching Li-Fi TCG. Real quick video for you today on my favorite Pauper deck, or one of my favorites, Tortured Existence. So this update is after the Crimson Vow set has just been spoiled. I'm not using any cards from that set, so this is just a way to let you know like what period of time this was recorded and what my opinions were or are at the moment. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, just the things that I've recently learned and tested. So the deck list, start with the lands, pretty unchanged from the last time that I showed this list. So 1 forest, 1 mountain, 8 swamps, 4 Ash Barrens, 4 Thriving Moor, and 4 Golgari Rot Farm. So there's 22 lands. The 23rd land, I have 1 Jungle Hollow. So in the past I suggested that maybe this should be a Wickerbough. I tested that for a bit and I didn't really like it. It's very unreliable to find it when you need it, basically. Usually what happens is you just end up playing it on turn 1 as a tapped swamp, which is not really that great of a card to be using. In that case, you'd just rather have the Jungle Hollow as the better mana fixing. Maybe instead of Jungle Hollow, you could also try a cycling land like a Tranquil Thicket or something. But Jungle Hollow is totally fine. Obviously, it does the job you need it to do. Then the spells. 4 Tortured Existence, of course, 4 Commune with the Gods, 4 Faithless Looting. Pretty straightforward. Then you have the creatures. So 5 Dredges, 2 Stinkweed Imp, 3 Brownscale. Pretty stock, same as I always use. 4 Sakura-Tribe Elder, just really strong as mana fixing and ramp. An effect the deck is pretty in need of. Then the workhorse cards of the deck, like the main win conditions, the board control for removal and blocking and killing the opponent. We have 3 Gorgon Recluse and 3 Crypt Rats. So that's again pretty consistently what I've been using in the past as well. And again, pretty consistently in the past, 2 Spore Frog, 2 Fume Spitter. The deck does need ways to interact cheaply. You have the combo with Gorgon Recluse and Spore Frog, which is very good against all kinds of decks in the format. Fume Spitter just gives you a nice way to interact early for only 1 mana versus things like Query and Ranger, Spell Starter Sprite, these kind of cards. Even Disciple of the Vault is very popular now since the Sojourner's Companion ban, so Fume Spitter is pretty good against that too. Just a good way to gain tempo basically for only 1 mana. So yeah, you can't have all your cards be expensive value mid-range stuff, because you can just fall behind and get run over. So these 4 cards are the antidote to that. Then the last few cards. So 1 new card that's been printed for Tortured Existence, because the Modern Horizons 2 set had a lot of madness cards in it. So the most interesting one is Kitchen Imp, which is 4 mana for a 2/2 flying haste, and it has madness for just black. So that's obviously very efficient card to play as a 2/2 creature flying haste for essentially only 1 mana when you madness it with Tortured Existence. But the problem is that I found that as a win condition, you couldn't play an aggressive plan with the deck just by that 1 card, because the deck by itself is too controlling and grindy. So essentially what Kitchen Imp did was that it only functioned as a win condition in games where you've effectively already taken control and won the game anyway, and you could, at that point, you could just win with Gorgon Recluse or whatever else. Occasionally it's nice that you have a 2/2 blocker for only 1 mana in matchups like Delver, for example, where that's a pretty useful thing to have. But overall, against decks like that, Crypt Rats is also very strong. So in general, I just found it wasn't a good match for the deck, the Kitchen Imp. But I do think the deck needs to have like a sort of minimum number of madness creatures for the Faithless Looting to be effective, and also to gain value from your Tortured Existence activations. So I have 2 Grave Scrabbler still as well. I think that's also what I used in the previous version of the deck. In terms of like getting mana as well, so you have the Sakura-Tribe Elder. I also still play 1 Tilling Treefolk. In the previous version of the list, I also had 1 copy of this card, and I also have 1 Krosan Tusker as well. So Tilling Treefolk is a pretty nice effect, like getting 2 lands back for only 3 mana and 1 card is quite strong. The issue is that Tilling Treefolk in multiple copies is not great because you run out of lands to return, and in the early game it can be a bit of a brick if you don't have any ways to get lands into your graveyard, like Faithless Looting or Commune with the Gods, anything like that. So you kind of want to play like 1.5 Tilling Treefolks, so Krosan Tusker is just like the next best option. You know, for 3 mana it helps find lands and creates value, and also the deck has no other like card draw effects. There's no cyclers, no other cyclers, no Llanowar Visionary or anything like that. So in games where you want to like dredge a bit more, for example, having an effect like Krosan Tusker that says draw a card on it can be useful as well. So yeah, pretty happy with that split at the moment. But I think like the Krosan Tusker, you could consider it as like the flex spot in the deck if you wanted to play a different card. That's where you kind of have to slot it in. I tested Twisted Abomination for a while, which is quite strong, especially against like Dimir Delver, for example. Like it's bigger than all their creatures, and they don't really have any way to kill it. So if you can resolve it when you have the black mana up, it basically like takes over the game. It's sort of like a Morphling or like Aetherling kind of card in Pauper against the matchups where they don't really have any way to deal with it. And of course it does have cycling as well, so it's not just like a 6-drop that does nothing in the early game. You can trade it in for a swamp. But the floor on a card like Twisted Abomination is much lower, because in the vast majority of cases it is just like spending 2 mana to trade it in for a swamp. So in that sense, Krosan Tusker is a lot more like reliably useful. So that's why I'm pretty happy with this at the moment. And then the last 2 cards I've been like going back and forth on the most, like deliberating the most on what these should be, because the rest of the deck is like a very solid like core of cards. You have your early game interaction, you have your like a win condition, like workhorse interactive cards, you have your lands finding stuff, you have your dredges, then you have all of the spells to set up your Tortured Existence, and then you have like your extra madness cards. So this all feels like relatively locked in. Like I said, like the Krosan Tusker is the only slot that really feels super flexible. But then I have these 2 other cards that could like conceivably be anything. And when I was like building the deck and like mapping the sideboard, what I basically eventually realized is that I had 2 slots in my sideboard for Monarch cards, and I could just put those to the main deck and gain 2 more sideboard slots. So in the past, where decks like Mono Blue Delver, for example, were a little bit more popular, playing a card like Thorn of the Black Rose in your main deck was a little bit more scary because it was too easy for other decks to set up in a way where they could just take the Monarch if you played it and then fall behind. So it was kind of like just a brick, like a dead card that you didn't want to cast. But now the way the format looks, with the Delver decks, are like the blue-black versions. They're a bit more slower, so they're not as likely to be able to overrun you if you play a Monarch card. The blue-black quote-unquote Delver decks, they have Monarch cards themselves anyway, so like there's like a limit to how bad a Monarch card can be, because if your opponent plays a Monarch card, then you can just play this yourself to take it, and you don't really it's not like you're taking a risk by introducing the Monarch into the game like you would before in that matchup. So yeah, I think the Thorn of the Black Rose is a strong inclusion. The other thing is that you're also like a Spore Frog deck, so you have ways to protect the Monarch. It's a bit stronger than it would be otherwise in like a sort of generic mid-range deck. I mean, that's sort of similar to how strong Palace Sentinels is in the white decks, because you can use Prismatic Strands with it to prevent you from taking damage, and you just keep drawing cards. So yeah, so that's the main deck to Thorn of the Black Rose. You can play the Red Monarch, the Crimson Fleet Commodore. In some matchups that's better, like the matchups like Tron and Familiars, where you want to just be as like aggressive as possible. So having the 5 power is relevant, but overall as a main deck card, the Thorn is better in enough other matchups that I prefer to play that main instead. So you do lose a little bit in the matchups where you want like the big attacker, but I think overall you still want the Thorn of the Black Rose. So yeah, that's the main deck. In the sideboard, so like I said, there's a few extra like sideboard slots now because of the Monarch cards that we put in the main deck. So we have a third Spore Frog, just for those very aggressive matchups where you want to protect yourself. 3 Faerie Macabre for mostly for flicker decks, but occasionally you come across some like weird reanimated brews, stuff like that. So yeah, mostly to stop any flicker shenanigans, pretty important. 2 Wickerbough Elder, so the main applications for Wickerbough Elder, firstly versus Tron, just because it's a big attacker and it kills Bonder's Ornament clean. That's also true versus like any basically Bonder's Ornament deck. So Pestilence or like any kind of mid-range list that's playing Wildfire, or usually they're playing Wildfire, but basically any deck that has Bonder's Ornament. So could be like a Boros deck with Bonder's Ornament or just things like that. I'm not actually boarding this in versus Affinity anymore, because with the loss of Sojourner's Companion, they only have Mere Enforcer that this card is good against, and it doesn't really like trade very well versus that against the entire rest of their deck. Like spending 5 mana to destroy 1 artifact is just such a bad trade. They're basically like an all-in ATOG combo deck now, so like having the Shatter isn't really that relevant. So we'll get to what I bought in against Affinity a bit later. So, and this is also fine versus Heroic and especially Bogles as well. Then versus Burn, we have the 4th Brownscale and the Gnaw to the Bone. Pretty important to have like some life gain in your sideboard, because otherwise you're just a slow mid-range deck that you don't have counter spells, and you don't really have like discard or anything like that either. So you do have some life gain main with your Brownscale engine, but you usually die before you can get that online quickly. So you just want to have some extra help to do that. Then the fourth, so I have some extra removal in the sideboard, so that's 1 Crypt Rats, and then it's meant to be 3 Viper's Kiss. So I have 2 Maya's Grasp here because I haven't been able to pick up 2 more Viper's Kiss. So you can play so yeah, so I talked about this a bit in my previous video, I think, but the good thing about Viper's Kiss, for only 1 mana, it stops Thermo Alchemist with the activated ability, right? Then versus decks like Elves and Wolves. So it stops Axebane Guardian and Overgrown Battlement for only 1 mana. You kill Quirion Ranger. Versus Elves, it stops Timberwatch if they expose their but they don't usually do it, but if they expose their Vanguard to it, then -1/-1 can kill it. And it also stops all of the, like, you can kill a Priest of Titania or whatever, just for the matchups where you really want as much removal as possible. Like, it just so happens that in Pauper that tends to be decks that have really significant activated abilities as well. So Viper's Kiss is really good. You can play 4 Viper's Kiss instead of the Crypt Rats if you want, and that makes the burn matchup slightly better, just having more outs to Thermo Alchemist. But having the Crypt Rats instead gives you extra options versus like Delver, and then versus decks like Elves. It's a bit better just to have the like extra sweeper. So yeah, so that's why I have the 3 Viper's Kiss. Remember, that's 3 Viper's Kiss, not Maya's Grasp, and then the 4th Crypt Rats in the sideboard as well. And then the last 3 sideboard slots. So here I have just random stuff. I have the Fleshbag Marauders and the Maya's Grasp. So I'm not playing any Fleshbag Marauder in the 75 anymore. Like, when the card was spoiled, it did seem a bit like a card that the deck could want to play. Because it was like an effect that the deck didn't really have access to before, and on paper it looks like totally reasonable. It's just like a 3 mana edict that you can loop with your Tortured Existence. The problem is that you don't really have any good stuff to sack to it except for maybe Grave Scrabbler. So like, it's just a very expensive Cruel Edict, which is not an efficient effect. There's so many ways in Pauper to block an edict for value. Like, there's people play like Thraben Inspector, people play like Augur Bolus, or just cheap creatures like Faerie Seer or whatever, where it just trades really badly on mana. So there's so many main deck matchups where it's just not very good. And then in sideboard games, you only really want it versus decks like Bogles and Heroic, and maybe something like Burn, where you're just desperate to have like as many outs to Thermo Alchemist as possible. But even versus decks like Bogles, for example, like, they have a lot of ways to beat a Fleshbag Marauder. Whether that's like Young Wolf or just having an extra Bogle or Glade Cover Scout to sack to it. And you don't really want to like spread yourself on too many plans. Like, are you trying to kill all their creatures, or are you trying to do like the fog plan? Like, how do you sideboard in a way that you can successfully juggle all of that at once? It's a little bit difficult. So I'm just abandoning the Fleshbag Marauder idea entirely. I'm not playing any in the 75 anymore. I don't think it's an effect that the deck really needs. So instead, what I'm playing in these 3 sideboard slots, which I don't have unfortunately to show you, is just 3 copies of Fangren Marauder. So that's the 6 mana 5/5 beast creature, I guess. Whenever an artifact dies, you may gain 5 life. So obviously that's just the anti-affinity card of choice, right? Because it's a 5/5, they can't Galvanic Blast it, and then it basically makes it really difficult for them to like ATOG kill you, because if they start sacrificing their artifacts, you start gaining more life than they're going to damage you. So it's obviously not a total like panacea. You have to like kill them somehow in the meantime, because if you give them infinite time, like depending on whose turn it is, there's some like shenanigans with how Disciple of the Vault triggers stack, for example, that they can ignore your life gain, things like that. So yeah, it's not like a complete lights out, but it does, having one of those in play does make it very difficult for an affinity opponent to win the game, and that gives you enough time to hopefully mount an attack with your Gorgon Recluse or whatever, or gain some even more life behind it with your Brownscale and such, so that you eventually take over and win the game. So yeah, Affinity is definitely like the most popular deck right now, so you do have to be prepared for it, and I think like the 3 Fangren Marauders are like the tool that you need to be able to do that. There's no other card that really does the job. Like I used to play Gorilla Shaman in the sideboard for Affinity, and that card's still okay, but with the indestructible lands now, it's just not very reliable anymore in a way of like shutting them out of the game. Fangren Marauder seems like the more appealing choice at the moment. So yep, that's the Tortured Existence deck updated for now. Unless they print any new cards or like the format changes, like there's another ban to Affinity card or something like that, I don't expect this list to change a whole lot or at all. Like I think it's achieved like a pretty strong mix of all the different effects that the deck wants, and it seems to be testing pretty well, so I'm happy with it. So yeah, this has been Li-Fi TCG, Pauper Tortured Existence, signing out.